The fluorescent lights in the Detroit diner buzzed like dying insects, casting a sickly yellow pall over Sarah Chen's face as she wiped down the counter for what felt like the thousandth time that shift. Her feet ached in the worn sneakers she couldn't afford to replace the same ones she'd been wearing for 8 months. The soles were so thin she could feel every crack in the tile floor beneath her. Each imperfection, a small reminder of how far she'd fallen and how much farther she might still fall. It was 11:30 at night, and the place was nearly empty, except for a trucker nursing his third cup of coffee in the corner booth, and a young couple too engrossed in each other to notice the world crumbling around them. Sarah glanced at the clock, calculating in her head like she always did. Another 30 minutes and she could clock out drive the 12 minutes home in her stuttering Honda Civic that threatened to die every time she turned the ignition, and maybe if she was lucky, get 4 hours of sleep before her alarm screamed at 6 in the morning for her second job at the dry cleaners. The tips tonight had been pathetic. $23 and change, barely enough to cover the late fee on her electric bill. Again, she stuffed the crumpled bills into her apron pocket and tried not to think about the stack of envelopes on her kitchen table, each one a red-stamped reminder of how far behind she had fallen. Rent was due in 5 days. 5 days, and she was short by $300. Mrs. Kowalski, her landlord, had been patient, more patient than Sarah deserved, but even patience had limits. The thought of packing up Dylan and Emma again, of seeing that confusion and worry in their eyes as they stuffed their lives into garbage bags one more time, made her stomach twist into knots. They'd moved 4 times in the past 6 years, each apartment smaller and shabbier than the last, each neighborhood a little more desperate. Dylan was 13 now, old enough to understand that their life was held together by duct tape and prayers. He never complained, not really, but Sarah saw the way he looked at other kids at school, the ones with new backpacks and phones that weren't held together with a cracked screen and sheer willpower. He'd started asking if he could get a job, deliver newspapers before school, anything to help. The offer broke Sarah's heart every time because no 13-year-old should have to worry about paying rent. Emma at 9 still had that childhood optimism, that belief that things would get better because Mom said so. She drew pictures of houses with yards and trees, taping them to the refrigerator like vision boards for a future that felt more fictional with each passing month. Sarah couldn't bear to be the one to shatter that innocence, to let her daughter see just how close they were to the edge every single day. The memory of 2 weeks ago still burned like acid in her throat. She'd been at the county courthouse fighting a denied unemployment claim from 6 months back when the dry cleaner had temporarily laid her off. The waiting room had been packed with people who looked just like her, worn down and holding on by their fingernails. And then Victor Brennan had walked in. She'd recognized him immediately, even though they'd never formally met. His face was plastered on billboards all over Port Huron and the surrounding counties. Brennan Properties, building Michigan's future. He wore a suit that probably cost $3,000, navy blue, with subtle pinstripes and a Rolex that caught the light every time he gestured. His lawyer walked 2 steps behind him, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Sarah. Victor had been there contesting some zoning violation, treating the whole proceeding like an inconvenience beneath his notice. When Sarah's case was called, she'd walked past him to approach the clerk's window. That's when he'd looked up from his phone, his eyes traveling over her discount store clothes and scuffed shoes with unconcealed disdain. The words he'd said as she passed still echoed in her mind. "Ms. Chen, isn't it I heard about your situation? Unfortunate. But people like you really shouldn't dream about property ownership. Better to stick to serving coffee and let those who understand real estate handle the complicated things." His tone had been light, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. Like he was offering helpful advice rather than grinding her face into her own poverty. His lawyer had chuckled. The clerk had pretended not to hear. And Sarah had kept walking, her face burning, because what could she say? He was right. She was a waitress and a dry cleaner employee who could barely keep a roof over her children's heads. What did she know about property? But she'd memorized his face. The distinguished gray at his temples. The way his mouth curved into a smile that never reached his eyes. The casual cruelty of someone who'd never worried about money in his entire life. Sarah finished wiping the counter and checked on the trucker, who waved her off without looking up. The couple had finally noticed the time and were gathering their things. In 15 minutes she could leave. 15 minutes and then the drive home, and then 4 hours of sleep if she was lucky, and then it would start all over again. The phone in her apron pocket vibrated. She pulled it out, expecting another bill collector or a robocall, but the number was local and unfamiliar. She almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail like she did with most calls these days. But something made her swipe the screen. A woman's voice, professional and clipped, came through the line. "Is this Sarah Chen?" Sarah's heart immediately started racing because phone calls during work hours never brought good news, and calls this late at night were even worse. She confirmed her identity, her free hand already gripping the edge of the counter for support. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Hayes from Wendell and Associates, a law firm Sarah had never heard of. Then came the words that made no sense. "I'm calling regarding the estate of Leonard Whitmore. Are you familiar with that name, Leonard Whitmore?" The name triggered a dim memory, something from childhood that felt more like a dream than reality. A tall man with a gray beard at a family reunion her mother had dragged her to when she was maybe 7 or 8 years old. It had been summer, sticky and hot at some relative's house in the suburbs. The adults had talked while the kids ran around the yard, and this old man had approached her while she sat alone on the porch steps. He'd smelled like pipe tobacco and old books. He'd asked her name and she'd told him she uncertain. Then he'd reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, the kind you didn't see any more heavy and real, in a way modern coins weren't. He'd placed it in her small palm and told her to save it for something special. His voice had been kind, but there was something sad in his eyes, like he was looking at someone else through her. That was it. One meeting, one coin that she'd eventually spent on her mother's birthday cake when she was 10, and they'd had no money for celebrations. She remembered thinking at the time that this was probably what the old man had meant by something special. Margaret Hayes was still talking, pulling Sarah back to the present. "Mr. Whitmore passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 87. He was your father's second cousin, though the family connection was distant. According to his will, he's left his primary asset to you." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, even as she tried to keep her voice steady. An asset, maybe a savings account, maybe enough to catch up on rent, maybe a miracle. Her throat felt tight as she asked the question, "What kind of asset?" or paper shuffled on the other end of the line. Margaret's pause stretched too long, and Sarah knew instinctively that whatever was coming wasn't the miracle she'd let herself hope for. When the attorney finally spoke, her tone was carefully neutral. "A property, specifically a hotel structure, located outside Port Huron, the Riverside Inn." The words landed like stones. A hotel? Not money? Not a savings account? A building. Sarah's stomach dropped as Margaret continued. "The property has been vacant for approximately 15 years. There are some complications regarding back taxes and county violations. I'd recommend you come to our office to review the paperwork. Can you make an appointment this week?" Sarah looked at the clock on the wall, at the pile of work still waiting for her, at the impossibility of taking time off from either of her jobs. But something in Margaret's tone told her this wasn't optional. If she ignored this, it might come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't predict. Debt had a way of following people, and if her name was on some property with back taxes, that was her problem whether she wanted it or not. She agreed to Thursday afternoon, the only time she could possibly manage if she called in sick to the diner. Margaret gave her an address downtown and hung up without ceremony. Sarah stood in the empty diner, phone still in her hand, feeling more confused than hopeful. A hotel, vacant for 15 years, back taxes and violations. This wasn't a gift. This was a problem, dressed up in legal language. She finished her shift in a daze, counting out her drawer and hanging up her apron. The drive home took her through streets that grew progressively darker and more run down. Her apartment building was a 4-story walk-up in a neighborhood where gunshots weren't uncommon, and the police took their time responding to calls. She parked in the poorly lit lot and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her keys ready in her hand the way she'd learned to do years ago. Inside, Dylan was still awake despite the late hour, sitting at their tiny kitchen table with his math homework spread out under the single overhead light. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the worry in his eyes before he covered it with a neutral expression. He'd gotten too good at hiding his feelings, too practiced at pretending everything was fine. She kissed the top of his head and asked about homework. He shrugged, said it was fine, then hesitated before adding in a whisper that Emma was already asleep, and then even quieter, "Mom, I heard Mrs. Kowalski talking to someone in the hallway today. Something about an eviction notice." Sarah's chest tightened. She'd been hoping for another week, maybe two, before the landlord made it official. She forced her voice to stay calm, told Dylan not to worry, that she'd handle it. But she could see he didn't believe her anymore, and that hurt worse than any eviction notice. After he'd gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table and stared at the stack of bills. Red stamps and final notices. The electric company threatening disconnection. The water bill past due. Her car insurance lapsed. And now this mysterious property in Port Huron with its own set of problems. She pulled out her ancient laptop and searched for Leonard Whitmore online. The results were sparse. An obituary in a Port Huron newspaper. Leonard Whitmore, 87, died peacefully after a brief illness. No surviving spouse or children. No mention of his career or accomplishments. Just dates and the name of a funeral home. She searched for the Riverside Inn next and found a listing on a real estate site that made her heart sink further. The photos showed a two-story structure set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and leaning trees. The paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood underneath. Several windows on the second floor were broken, jagged glass teeth catching the light. The description was brief and damning. Historic property requiring extensive renovation. Sold as is, back taxes owed. She went to Google Maps and looked at the satellite view. The building sat on what appeared to be several acres near Lake Huron, isolated from the main town. Even from above, it looked abandoned, a ghost of whatever it had once been. She zoomed in and noticed something odd. One of the basement windows appeared to have newer security bars, the metal still dark rather than rusted like the rest of the structure. Someone had reinforced that window recently. Why would anyone bother securing an abandoned building? Sarah stayed up until 3 in the morning, researching property law and tax liens, trying to understand what she'd inherited. The news wasn't good. If she was named as the legal owner, the debt belonged to her. The county could seize the property for unpaid taxes, but they might also come after her personally for the balance if the auction didn't cover what was owed. She was trapped either way. Unless. The thought formed slowly, born of desperation. What if she moved into the hotel? It would be terrible, probably dangerous, definitely not suitable for children, but it would save her $1,200 a month in rent. 3 months of savings meant $3,600. Maybe enough time to strip the place for salvageable materials and sell them before the county took it. Copper pipe, old fixtures, anything of value. It wasn't a solution, but it was something other than waiting for eviction. She thought about Frank Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's husband, who'd passed away the year before. He'd been a construction engineer, retired with opinions about buildings and materials and proper maintenance. He'd helped Sarah fix her leaking sink once, showing her how to identify the problem and repair it herself rather than calling a plumber they couldn't afford. While he'd worked, he'd talked about his career, about the old buildings he'd worked on, about how people didn't build things to last anymore. He'd said something she remembered now. "Sometimes the worst-looking places hide the best opportunities, Sarah. Nobody wants to look at a dump, so they miss what's underneath. That's when smart people pay attention." Could the Riverside Inn be like that? Or was she just desperately trying to find hope in a hopeless situation? Thursday afternoon arrived cold and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched Sarah's mood. She'd called in sick to the diner, something she never did, and the guilt sat heavy in her stomach. She needed every shift, every tip, every dollar. But she also needed to understand what she was dealing with. The law office was downtown in an old building with marble floors and dark wood paneling that made Sarah feel like she was trespassing. Her clothes, the only dress pants she owned, and a blouse from a thrift store, felt shabby in the hushed elegance of the waiting room. She sat with her hands folded, trying not to fidget while other clients came and went. All of them looked more prosperous than her, more like they belonged in a place like this. When Margaret Hayes finally called her back, Sarah followed her into a small conference room where a stack of folders sat waiting on the table like a pile of secrets about to be revealed. Margaret was younger than Sarah had expected from her voice, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and a tailored suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. She got right to business, spreading documents across the table with practiced efficiency. Leonard Whitmore had purchased the Riverside Inn in 1974, Margaret explained, pointing to a yellow deed. He'd operated it as a small motor lodge until 1990, After that, records showed he'd closed it to the public but continued to own the property. He'd paid minimal maintenance, let the building deteriorate, and accumulated substantial tax debt. Upon his death, the property defaulted to Sarah as his sole named heir. Sarah stared at the papers at the legal language that might as well have been written in another language. The question escaped before she could stop it. Why me? I didn't even know him. Margaret's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional armor. His will doesn't specify his reasoning. My understanding from his former attorney, who's since retired, is that Leonard had a falling out with most of the family decades ago. Something to do with his divorce and business dealings. You were young enough not to have been part of that conflict. Perhaps he saw it as a fresh start, or perhaps he simply had no one else. She slid another document across the table, this one with numbers that made Sarah's breath catch. The property owed $41,000 in back taxes and county fees. If those weren't paid within 90 days, the county would seize the property and auction it to recover the debt, $41,000. Sarah couldn't even process a number that large. She didn't have $41 in her checking account most days. This wasn't a gift or an opportunity. This was a curse, a joke played by a dead man who probably didn't know or care what kind of position he was putting her in. Her voice came out small. Can I just sign it over to the county? Now let them take it and be done with it. Margaret considered this, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. You could, or you could visit the property first, see what you're dealing with. The structure itself might have salvage value, materials you could sell, or you might be able to negotiate with the county for more time, perhaps find a buyer willing to take on the tax debt in exchange for the land. Sarah left the office with a folder full of documents she didn't understand and directions to a place she'd never heard of. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, engine running, for heat, trying to decide if she should just throw the whole folder in the trash and forget this had ever happened. But $41,000 in debt didn't just disappear because you ignored it. If she was named as the owner, that debt might follow. Her might make her already terrible financial situation even worse. She needed to at least see the place, understand what she was dealing with. Maybe there was something salvageable. Maybe Frank had been right about terrible-looking places hiding value. She called her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, no relation, but kind enough to watch the kids sometimes, and asked if she could pick up Dylan and Emma from school. Then she pointed her car north toward Port Huron. The drive took just over an hour through suburbs that gradually gave way to flat farmland and small towns that looked like time had forgotten them. Port Huron sat at the edge of Lake Huron, a faded industrial city that had once thrived on shipping and manufacturing. Now it wore its decline like a shabby coat with empty storefronts and houses that needed paint. Sarah followed Margaret's directions, turning off the main highway onto a two-lane road that ran parallel to the water. After 3 miles, she spotted it. The Riverside Inn looked worse in person than in photographs. The two-story structure sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown grass that reached nearly to the first-floor windows. Trees leaned at odd angles, their branches scraping against the roof. The paint, which might have once been white or pale yellow, had peeled away to expose wood that had weathered to the color of ash. Several windows on the second floor were indeed broken, and the front door was boarded up with plywood that had faded to match the rest of the decay. A chain with a rusted padlock hung across the entrance, and a sign near the road, so weathered that Sarah could barely read it, announced the property name in letters that had mostly flaked away. Orange X marks had been spray painted on several sections of the exterior, the kind of symbols fire departments use to indicate structural hazards. Someone had deemed this place dangerous years ago. Sarah parked her car and sat for a moment, just staring. This was her inheritance. Not a helping hand, not a nest egg, just a rotting building that was probably one strong wind away from collapsing entirely. She felt tears prick her eyes and hated herself for it, for allowing even a moment of hope to creep in when the phone call had first come. She got out of the car, her feet crunching on gravel and broken glass, and walked closer. The smell hit her first, that distinctive odor of decay and mold and time standing still. Everything organic that could rot had rotted. Everything metal that could rust had rusted. The building seemed to wag under its own weight, tired and ready to give up. She tried the front door, but the padlock held firm. Walking around the side, she found the window she'd seen in the satellite image, the one with the newer security bars. Up close, the contrast was even more obvious. The bars were industrial-grade thick steel installed with heavy bolts that looked less than a year old. Fresh holes had been drilled into the stone foundation to secure them. Someone had gone to significant trouble and expense to protect this particular window while letting the rest of the building fall apart. Sarah peered through the bars into the darkness below. Her phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing what appeared to be a basement level. She could make out concrete walls and the suggestion of a floor, but not much else. Why reinforce this one window? What was down there that needed protecting? She continued her circuit of the building. The back was even worse than the front. A parking lot full of potholes and weeds. A dumpster overflowing with garbage that had probably been there for years. A small outbuilding with a roof that had caved in completely. There was no salvaging this. No buyer in their right mind would want it, not with $41,000 in debt attached. The county would take it, bulldoze it, and probably send her a bill for the demolition costs. She was already imagining how she would explain this to Dylan and Emma, another failure in a long line of broken promises and dashed hopes. But then something shifted in her mind, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat without at least trying. She'd been backed into corners her entire adult life. She'd learned to fight for every scrap of stability she managed to create. Maybe there was something here she wasn't seeing. Maybe Frank's words about terrible places hiding value weren't just empty optimism. At the very least, she needed to get inside and do a proper inventory before the county showed up with bulldozers. And she needed a place to live. The eviction from her Detroit apartment was coming whether she liked it or not. Mrs. Kowalski had been patient, but patience didn't pay bills. If Sarah moved into the Riverside Inn even temporarily, she'd save 3 months of rent. That would give her time to figure something out, to strip the place for parts if nothing else. It would be terrible for the kids, but they'd survived worse. Hadn't they? She drove back to Detroit that evening with a plan forming, one that terrified her even as she committed to it. The apartment was suffocating anyway. The bills were piling up regardless. And at least the hotel had a roof, more or less. She'd need tools, bolt cutters for the chain, a crowbar for the boards, cleaning supplies. A way to make one room livable enough for 3 people. She waited until Friday night to tell Dylan and Emma. After dinner, sitting at their small kitchen table that wobbled no matter how many folded napkins she stuck under the leg, she explained that they were moving. That a relative she'd barely known had left her a property. That it wasn't nice that it needed work, but that it was theirs, and it meant they wouldn't have to worry about rent for a while. Dylan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. His voice cracked as he spoke. "We're moving to a hotel. Is that even legal? Mom, I've seen horror movies that start like this." Emma was more excited, still young enough to see adventure, where Dylan saw disaster. "Does it have a pool?" Sarah felt her heart break a little. She took Emma's small hand in hers. "No pool, baby. And it's not a nice hotel like you're thinking. It's old and it needs a lot of work. But it's ours, sort of, and it means we don't have to worry about Mrs. Kowalski asking us to leave." Dylan stood up from the table, his chair scraping loud against the linoleum. "This is insane. We should stay here. I'll get I can help with rent." Sarah reached for his hand, but he pulled away. She kept her voice soft. "You're 13. It's not your job to fix this. It's mine, and I know this sounds crazy, but I need you to trust me. We're not going to stay there forever. Just long enough for me to figure out what to do with the property." She could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt that was eating at her own resolve. But eventually he nodded. What choice did any of them have? They packed their lives into boxes and garbage bags over the following week. Sarah gave notice to Mrs. Kowalski, who accepted it with a sad smile and wished them luck. She kept both her jobs, lying to her supervisors about her new address, knowing that Port Huron was too far to commute daily, but hoping she could figure out some arrangement. Maybe work 3 days a week. Maybe find something closer. Maybe something would work out. On a cold Saturday morning in early October, they loaded everything they owned into the Honda Civic and a borrowed truck. The kids were quiet. Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit and stared out the window. Dylan had his headphones on, his face turned away. Neither of them believed this would end well, and Sarah couldn't blame them. The Riverside Inn looked even worse in the harsh morning light. Sarah had come prepared with bolt cutters for the chain, a crowbar for the boards, and a determination born of sheer desperation. It took her 20 minutes to get the front door open, the wood screaming in protest as she pried away the plywood. The interior smelled like death and abandonment, and she saw Emma's excited expression crumble into something closer to horror. Sarah forced brightness into her voice. "It's okay, we're going to clean it up. It'll be fine." But fine was a lie, and they all knew it. The lobby was a disaster of water damage and collapsed ceiling tiles. The furniture, what remained of it, was covered in dirty sheets and years of dust. Debris littered the floor ankle-deep in places. The walls were stained with brown blooms of mold that had spread like continents across a map of decay. She had already scouted out the least damaged room on the first floor during her previous visit, a former office space that still had a door that closed and windows that were mostly intact. They spent the entire day cleaning, wearing masks against the dust and mold, scrubbing surfaces with bleach until Sarah's hands were raw. Dylan worked in angry silence. Emma tried to stay cheerful but kept looking like she might cry. By nightfall, they'd created a small, livable space. 3 air mattresses on the floor, their clothes stacked in corners, a camping stove for cooking until Sarah could figure out if any of the hotel's appliances still worked. They ate cold sandwiches by flashlight because the electricity had been shut off years ago, and Sarah promised them she would get it turned back on soon, though she had no idea how she would afford the deposit. That first night was the longest of Sarah's life. Every sound was amplified in the empty building. The wind rattled loose boards. The structure settled with groans that sounded almost human. Emma crawled into Sarah's sleeping bag around midnight, whimpering that she heard footsteps upstairs. Sarah whispered that it was just the building, that old buildings made noise, that they were safe. But Sarah didn't feel safe. She felt like she'd made a catastrophic mistake, like she'd put her children in danger because of her own pride and stubbornness. Dylan lay on his mattress with his back to them, and Sarah knew he wasn't sleeping, knew he was angry and scared, and trying not to show it. She wanted to cry, wanted to pack them all back into the car and run back to Detroit. But there was nothing to run back to. She'd already given up the apartment, had already burned that bridge. They were here now, for better or worse, and she had to make it work. She had to believe that something good could come from this nightmare, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The next morning, Sarah woke early and decided to explore the building properly. She needed to understand what she was working with, what might be salvageable. Dylan and Emma were still asleep, exhausted from the previous day's work. She grabbed her flashlight and started on the first floor, checking each room systematically. Most were in terrible condition. Guest rooms with mattresses that had rotted through, a dining area with tables that collapsed when she touched them, a kitchen where the appliances had rusted into sculptures of their former selves. Everything confirmed her worst fears. There was nothing here of value. But then she reached the lobby and started examining the walls more carefully. That's when she noticed it's something she'd missed during the initial cleaning frenzy. A section of wall paneling had partially collapsed, and behind it, barely visible, was a door. Not a regular door, but something different. Heavier, darker wood than the cheap pine used throughout the rest of the building. And running down its length were 4 heavy-duty locks, rusted, nearly solid, but unmistakably real. Sarah's pulse quickened. She remembered Frank Kowalski's lessons about old buildings, about how people always hid things. Valuables. Secrets. This door looked like it was meant to keep people out of something important. She retrieved her toolbox from the car and selected the crowbar, the same one she'd used to open the front door. The first lock resisted, the metal grinding against itself as she worked it back and forth. Rust flaked away in orange chunks, staining her hands. After 10 minutes of persistent effort, she felt something give, and the lock popped open with a sound like a small bone breaking. Encouraged, she moved to the second lock, then the third, then the fourth. Each one was a battle. Each one left her with scraped knuckles and sore muscles. But eventually they all gave way. She stood back, breathing hard, staring at the door that was now technically unlocked, but still firmly closed, held by decades of swollen wood and accumulated grime. She wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame and pulled with everything she had. The door groaned, shifted an inch, then stuck again. She repositioned, pulled again, and this time it gave with a shriek of protest that seemed to echo through the entire building. The space beyond was black, a darkness so complete that her phone's flashlight barely dented it. She aimed the beam down a set of concrete stairs that descended into what had to be the basement. The air that wafted up smelled stale and thick, carrying odors of must and dampness and something else, something almost metallic. A voice from behind made her jump. Mom, what are you doing? She turned to find Dylan standing there rubbing sleep from his eyes, looking worried. Before she could answer, he'd crossed to her side and peered down the stairs. Is that safe? Sarah didn't know, but something about those reinforced bars on the basement window, about this locked door, told her there was more to this building than rotten decay. She told Dylan to stay upstairs, that she'd be right back, and descended slowly, testing each step before trusting it with her full weight. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the building. The ceiling was low, crisscrossed with pipes and electrical conduits that hadn't carried power in years. Her light swept across concrete walls spotted with efflorescence, an industrial boiler that looked like something out of a nightmare, and stacks of cardboard boxes that had mostly disintegrated into pulp. She was about to turn back, convinced there was nothing down here but more decay, when her light caught something metallic in the far corner. She picked her way across the debris-strewn floor, her heart hammering for reasons she couldn't quite name. The metallic glint came from another door, but not wood like upstairs. This was steel industrial grade, with a handle that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. An emblem was stamped into the metal, faded but still visible. The logo of a bank, First National, something though the letters were too worn to read completely. She reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned smoothly in her hand, well-oiled despite years of apparent disuse. The vault door swung open silently, and Sarah's flashlight beam fell on a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. The space was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with metal shelving lining 3 walls. On those shelves were boxes, dozens of them made of sturdy plastic and clearly labeled with dates and codes written in permanent marker. There were also binders, the thick kind with metal rings organized in neat rows like books in a library. Everything was surprisingly clean, protected from the basement's dampness by the sealed vault. The air inside felt different, cooler, with a faint mechanical hum that suggested climate control equipment still running somewhere in the walls. Sarah reached for the nearest box, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were papers, documents stacked with meticulous care. The first thing she saw was a bank statement from 1983, First National Bank of Chicago, letterhead, still crisp despite the decades. The balance listed made her blink and read it again, $214,000. She grabbed another document from the same box. A property deed for land in northern Michigan, 200 acres, purchased in 1976. Another paper, a stock certificate for shares in a company she didn't recognize, dated 1989, 50,000 shares at $12 each. She pulled down another box, then another. Everywhere she looked, there were more documents, more accounts, more assets, all carefully cataloged and preserved. Bank statements from institutions across the Midwest. Stock certificates from the 70s and 80s for companies that had been startups then. Real estate deeds for properties scattered across 3 states. Bonds issued by municipalities that had probably matured decades ago. Sarah sank down onto the concrete floor, boxes spread around her like treasure spilled from a chest. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. Leonard Whitmore hadn't been poor. He hadn't left her a worthless building out of spite or neglect. He'd been hiding something, storing something, using the hotel as a shell to protect assets he didn't want anyone to find. But why and how much was this actually worth? Most of the documents were decades old. Some of the accounts might be closed. Some of the properties might have been sold. But there was so much here, such a volume of paperwork, that even if half of it was obsolete, there had to be something of real value. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made her look up. Dylan appeared in the doorway of the vault, his eyes going wide as he took in the shelves, the boxes, the papers scattered around his mother. "Mom, what is all this?" Sarah's throat felt tight. She gestured at the documents. "I don't know yet, but I think Leonard was hiding money. A lot of money." Dylan crouched beside her, picking up one of the bank statements, his lips moving as he read the numbers. "Mom, this says 200,000. Is that real?" Before Sarah could answer, Emma's voice called from upstairs, high and worried. "Mom, Dylan, where are you?" Sarah called back that they were in the basement, that everything was fine. She heard Emma's small feet on the stairs, and then her daughter appeared, looking simultaneously scared of the darkness and curious about what they'd found. Emma crossed to them, carefully avoiding the debris, and her eyes went round when she saw him. When she saw inside the vault, "Is this a secret room like in movies?" Sarah pulled Emma close, trying to organize her thoughts. She needed help, professional Help someone who could tell her if any of this was real or if she was sitting in a basement clinging to worthless paper. But she also needed to be careful. If word got out that there might be significant assets hidden here, people would come looking. People like Victor Brennan, who already seemed to know more about this property than he should. She told the kids they needed to keep this quiet, that they couldn't tell anyone about what they'd found until she understood what it meant. Dylan looked skeptical but nodded. Emma promised solemnly, making a zipping motion across her lips. Sarah gathered a few representative documents, chose boxes that seemed to cover different time periods and asset types, and led them back upstairs. The morning light filtering through the dirty windows felt harsh after the vault's darkness. Sarah locked the heavy steel door and made sure the entrance was concealed again behind the collapsed paneling. She needed to think, to plan to figure out her next move. But first she needed to get the kids settled and fed. They ate breakfast from the cooler they'd brought, cereal with milk that was already getting warm. Dylan kept glancing at his mother with questions in his eyes. Emma chattered about exploring the upstairs, about whether any of the rooms might have hidden passages. Sarah only half listened, her mind churning through possibilities and risks. After breakfast, she set the kids up with cleaning supplies and instructions to make their sleeping space more livable. Then she pulled out her phone and searched for estate attorneys in Port Huron. Margaret Hayes had handled the inheritance paperwork, but Sarah didn't fully trust her. Margaret worked for a firm that had represented Leonard's estate, and Sarah didn't know enough about any of this to be certain there weren't conflicts of interest. She needed someone independent, someone whose loyalty would be to her alone. The Port Huron Library website had a community resources page that listed local legal services. She found a name: Diana Price Estate, and probate attorney practicing for 25 years, office downtown. Sarah called and explained vaguely that she'd inherited property with some financial documents and needed help understanding what she had. The receptionist scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Sarah spent the next hour carefully selecting documents from the vault. She chose a representative sample that included account statements, property deeds, stock certificates, and the master index binder that seemed to catalog everything. She put them all in a large envelope and told Dylan she'd be gone for a few hours, that he was in charge, that he should keep Emma inside and not open the door for anyone. Dylan's expression was serious. "Mom, is this dangerous? Should we be worried?" Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to reassure him, but she'd never lied to her son about important things, and she wasn't going to start now. "I don't know yet, but I need you to be careful. If anyone comes around asking questions, you don't know anything. We just moved in. That's all." The drive to downtown Port Huron took 15 minutes through streets that showed the city's faded prosperity. Grand old homes that had been subdivided into apartments. Storefronts with dusty windows and "for lease" signs. A downtown that had probably been vibrant 50 years ago and was now just hanging on. Diana Price's office was in a brick building that had seen better days, but was at least maintained, with a fresh coat of paint on the door and clean windows. The waiting room was small and functional, with chairs that had been reupholstered and magazines from the past 6 months. Sarah gave her name to the receptionist, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, and waited only 10 minutes before being called back. Diana Price was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that assessed Sarah with keen intelligence. She wore slacks and a cardigan rather than a suit, and her office was lined with law books that looked actually used rather than decorative. She invited Sarah to sit, offered coffee that Sarah gratefully accepted, and settled behind a desk covered in neat stacks of papers. Sarah laid out the documents, explaining in a rush how she'd found them, where they had been hidden, what little she knew about Leonard Whitmore. Diana listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but focused. When Sarah finished, Diana pulled the documents closer and began examining them, her silence stretching uncomfortably. She picked up the index binder first, flipping through pages covered in Leonard's precise handwriting. Categories and codes, dates and amounts, a systematic record of decades of accumulation. Then she examined several bank statements, holding them up to the light, checking watermarks and security features. She opened her laptop and started typing, checking account numbers against databases Sarah couldn't see. After 20 minutes, Diana set down the papers and looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been disbelief. "Do you understand what this is?" Sarah shook her head, her throat suddenly dry. "I know it's money or assets or something. I know it's more than I've ever seen in my life. But I don't know if it's real, if I can actually access any of it or if it's just paper that looks impressive. Diana picked up her phone and made a call speaking in low tones to someone on the other end about dormant accounts and verification procedures. She hung up and made another call this time to what sounded like a county records office asking about property deeds from the 70s. A third call went to someone Diana addressed as Marcus requesting forensic accounting services for a complex estate. Each conversation was brief and professional, giving away little but gathering information. Finally, Diana set the phone down and met Sarah's eyes. These accounts existed. Most of them are what we call dormant or frozen, meaning no one has accessed them for years, and the banks have set them aside pending proper claims. The real estate holdings appear legitimate based on preliminary checks. The deeds are recorded with the appropriate counties. The stocks and bonds will need extensive verification, but if they're authentic, they've likely accumulated significant value over the decades, especially if there were splits or reinvested dividends. She paused, and Sarah felt the weight of that pause like a physical thing pressing down on her chest. Diana's next words came slowly, carefully measured. Based on what I'm seeing here, and I want to be very clear that this is a preliminary assessment, we could be looking at total assets to the range of $70 to $100 million. The number hung in the air between them like something from another dimension. Sarah heard it, understood the words individually, but couldn't make them connect to anything real. Her voice came out as a whisper, "That can't be right." Diana nodded slowly as if she'd expected this reaction. "I need to do a full investigation, verify every account and holding, determine what's still accessible and what may have been escheated to the state. But yes, Mrs. Chen, this is real. Your relative appears to have been an extremely private, extremely wealthy man who chose to hide his assets rather than use them. The question now is whether you, as his heir, can establish legal claim to these holdings." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. $70 to $100 million. She thought about the $300 she couldn't scrape together for rent 2 months ago. She thought about the $41,000 in taxes that had seemed like an insurmountable mountain. She thought about Dylan's resignation and Emma's fading optimism and her own bone-deep exhaustion from working 2 jobs that were grinding her into dust. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "What do I need to do?" Diana leaned forward, her expression serious. "First, we need to secure everything, make copies of every document, store the originals in a proper safe deposit box. Second, we need to engage a forensic accountant and a probate attorney who specializes in complex estates. I can handle some of this, but you'll need a team. Third, and this is important, you need to not tell anyone about this until we have a clearer picture. Large sums of money bring out the worst in people. And until we've established your claim, definitively discretion is your best protection." Sarah absorbed this, her mind already racing ahead to the practical problems. How long will it take? Diana considered to verify everything and begin the process of transferring assets conservatively 6 to 9 months. Some of these accounts have been dormant for 30 years. We're going to have to navigate bureaucracy, banking regulations, and estate law in multiple states. It's going to be complicated. 6 to 9 months felt like forever and no time at all. Sarah left Diana's office in a daze, clutching the envelope of documents like a life preserver. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, trying to process everything, one hand on the steering wheel, the other pressed against her mouth. Part of her was terrified that this was a mistake, that Diana had misread something, or that the accounts would turn out to be empty or inaccessible. But another part, a part that was growing stronger, dared to hope. She thought about paying off the hotel's tax debt, about getting the kids into a proper house with heat and running water, about not having to work 2 jobs that left her so exhausted she sometimes fell asleep in her car between shifts. She thought about Dylan's college fund and Emma's dreams and a future that wasn't defined by just surviving to the next day. When she got back to the Riverside Inn, she found Dylan and Emma in the makeshift living space. Dylan had organized their clothes into neat stacks. Emma had arranged her stuffed animals on her air mattress like a small army keeping watch. They both looked up when Sarah entered, and something in her expression must have been different because Dylan immediately asked what had happened. Sarah sat down with them, choosing her words carefully. "I talked to a lawyer today. She looked at the papers we found. She thinks Leonard had money saved, more than I realized. She's going to investigate to make sure it's real and that we can access it." Emma's eyes went wide. Like how much money, Sarah smiled despite herself. Enough to fix this place up. Enough to get us a real house. Enough that I won't have to work 2 jobs anymore. Dylan's skepticism was palpable. He set down the shirt he'd been folding and fixed his mother with a look too old for 13. Mom, people don't just leave random money lying around. Are you sure this is real? That it's not some kind of scam? Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. I'm not sure of anything yet, but the lawyer seemed confident. We have to wait while she investigates. Everything makes sure it's all legitimate. But yes, baby, I think this might be real. I think we might finally catch a break. She saw something in Dylan's face, then a flicker of the hope he tried so hard to keep buried, and it broke her heart a little. These kids had learned too young not to trust good news, not to believe in happy endings. They'd been disappointed too many times, had watched too many of their mother's plans fall apart despite her best efforts. The next few weeks fell into a strange rhythm. Sarah continued working both jobs, though she'd had to rearrange her schedules to make the commute from Port Huron manageable. She worked the diner 3 nights a week and the dry cleaner 4 days, leaving before dawn and returning late. Dylan took on more responsibility, getting himself and Emma ready for their new schools, making simple dinners from their camping stove, keeping the hotel as clean as possible given its condition. Diana Price worked with the team she'd assembled, untangling decades of financial history. She called Sarah every few days with updates. An account in Chicago had been verified, frozen since 1995, still containing its original deposit plus minimal interest. Land in northern Michigan had been located in county records, 200 acres of undeveloped forest that was now valuable for timber rights. Stock certificates were being authenticated through corporate records departments. Each confirmation felt surreal. Each phone call made Sarah's hands shake. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to realize there had been a mistake, for the dream to collapse back into nightmare. But the evidence kept mounting piece by piece that Leonard Whitmore had indeed accumulated a fortune and hidden it in the most unlikely place imaginable. It was during this waiting period, about 4 weeks after finding the vault, that Sarah first noticed something troubling in Leonard's financial records. Diana had asked her to go through the boxes more systematically, creating a detailed inventory of every document. Sarah spent her evenings in the vault, Dylan and Emma asleep upstairs, sorting papers by date and category. That's when she found the folder marked 2007-2008 positions. Inside were transaction records from several investment accounts, all showing the same pattern. Leonard had taken massive short positions on mortgage-backed securities. He'd purchased credit default swaps that would pay out when housing loans failed. The documentation was extensive and damning. Leonard had bet against the housing market, and when it collapsed in 2008, he'd made millions. The number, when Sarah finally tallied all the accounts, came to $47 million in profit from the financial crisis. $47 million earned from the suffering of families who'd lost their homes, their savings, their futures. Families like Sarah's own. Her mother had lost their house to foreclosure in 2009, the stress and shame of it eating away at her until the cancer diagnosis came a year later. Sarah sat on the cold floor of the vault, holding Leonard's transaction records, feeling sick. This fortune she'd been hoping would save her family, that she'd been planning to use to build a better life, had been built in part on other people's ruin. How many families had been destroyed so Leonard could add zeros to his bank accounts? How many children had experienced what Dylan and Emma were experiencing, now the instability and fear, because people like Leonard had profited from their parents' desperation? She kept reading, looking for something that would explain or justify what Leonard had done. And she found it, though it didn't make her feel better. In a separate folder labeled Atonement, she discovered records of anonymous donations Leonard had made between 2009 and 2015. $8 million given to homeless shelters, food banks, foreclosure prevention programs, legal aid societies. As if money could undo the harm, could buy back the homes and marriages and lives that had been destroyed. Leonard had known what he'd done. He'd felt guilty enough to try to make amends, but he'd kept the rest, hidden it away, and now he was passing that blood money to her. Sarah felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. She thought about refusing it, about walking away and letting the county take the building and everything in it. But then she thought about Dylan working himself to exhaustion at 13 because he felt responsible for their situation. She thought about Emma's drawings of houses they'd never afford, dreams that were dying a little more each day. When she climbed back upstairs, she found Dylan still awake, doing homework by flashlight. He looked up when she entered, took one look at her face, and set down his pencil. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sarah sat beside him and told him the truth, something she'd always tried to do about important things. She explained where part of Leonard's money had come from, about the 2008 crisis, about the donations he'd made, trying to atone. She watched Dylan process this information, saw him struggling with the same moral conflict that was tearing her apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Grandma lost the house because of what those people did. People like Leonard." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Dylan was silent for a long moment, staring at his homework without seeing it. Then he looked at his mother, but Leonard didn't cause the crisis. He just saw it coming and protected himself. And then he tried to help people after. That's more than most of them did. The observation was more mature than Sarah expected, and it cut through her spiraling guilt. "You think we should keep it if it turns out to be real?" Dylan met her eyes. "I think we should use it to help people who are going through what we went through, what Grandma went through. Maybe that's what Leonard wanted. Why he gave it to you instead of some rich relative who wouldn't care." The simplicity of it, the clarity, made Sarah's chest tight. She pulled Dylan into a hug, feeling him stiffen in that teenage way before relaxing into it. "When did you get so wise?" His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "I've been paying attention." The next morning, Sarah called Diana and told her what she'd found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Diana responded. "Sarah, I need to be clear about something. What Leonard did was legal. Controversial, yes, and many would say immoral. But legal. It doesn't affect your claim to the estate. The question is whether you can live with inheriting money made that way." Sarah had already decided. "If we get it, I want to use it to help people. Set up programs for families facing eviction, job training for single parents. Things that prevent the kind of crisis Leonard profited from. Can we do that?" Diana's voice warmed slightly. "Yes, we can establish a foundation, structure it so the money does good. But first, we have to get through probate and verification. That's still going to take months." 2 weeks later, the first major blow came. Diana called Sarah during her lunch break at the dry cleaner, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We have a problem. Robert Whitmore, Leonard's nephew, just filed a legal challenge to the will. He's claiming Leonard was mentally incompetent when he wrote it and that the property should go to blood relatives. We have a court hearing in 10 days. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd known this was too good to be true, that something would go wrong. Her voice came out shaky. "Can he win?" Diana was already in problem-solving mode. "Not if we can prove Leonard was competent. I've already requested his medical records from the assisted living facility where he spent his last years. The staff there remember him as sharp and lucid. But we need to be prepared for a fight. Robert has hired expensive lawyers, which means he knows or suspects there are significant assets involved." The next 10 days were a blur of stress and preparation. Diana worked with Sarah to gather evidence of Leonard's mental competency, medical records showing no dementia or cognitive decline, testimony from nurses who'd known him, Leonard's own writings from his journals, which Sarah had found in the vault, demonstrating clear thinking and detailed financial planning. But as they prepared, other challenges emerged. A woman named Patricia Morris filed a palimony suit claiming she'd been Leonard's girlfriend and deserved a share of the estate. A man named Gerald Brennan, Victor's uncle, produced documents claiming Leonard owed him money from a failed business deal in 1979. Each new lawsuit had to be investigated, answered, documented. The media caught wind of the story. A reporter from the Port Huron Times called Sarah's cell phone asking for an interview about her inheritance. She declined, but that didn't stop the story from running. Single mother claims fortune from recluse millionaire. The article painted her as a gold digger who'd somehow manipulated an elderly man, never mind that she'd met Leonard exactly once at age 7. Dylan got into a fight at school when another kid called his mom a scammer. Emma came home crying because her teacher had asked pointed questions about where they were living and whether Sarah was a fit parent. The attention was suffocating, invasive, making their already difficult situation nearly unbearable. Then Victor Brennan made his move. He showed up at the Riverside Inn on a Tuesday afternoon while Sarah was at work, while only Dylan and Emma were there. Dylan called his mother, his voice tight with fear. "Mom, there's a man here. He says his name is Victor Brennan. He wants to come in and talk." Sarah's blood went cold. She told Dylan not to open the door, that she was on her way, and drove 90 miles an hour back to Port Huron. When she arrived, Victor's black Mercedes was still parked out front. The man himself stood near the entrance, perfectly calm, looking at the building like he was assessing its value. Sarah pulled up and got out, her heart pounding, "Get away from my property." Victor turned that same condescending smile she remembered from the courthouse. "Mrs. Chen, I was hoping we could talk business. I understand you're having some legal troubles with the inheritance. I'd like to make you an offer. $15,000 for the property as is. That's generous given the condition and the tax debt." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "It's not for sale." Victor's smile didn't waver. "Mrs. Chen, you're out of your depth. This property will bankrupt you. The legal fees alone will drain whatever resources you have. I'm offering you a way out. Take it while it stands." Sarah stepped back closer, making herself meet his eyes despite the fear churning in her gut. "I said it's not for sale. Now get off my property before I call the police." Victor's expression finally shifted, the friendly mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "I tried to do this the easy way, but if you want to learn the hard way, that's your choice. We'll see how long your stubbornness lasts when the county condemns this place and you're left with nothing but debt." He walked to his car, got in, and drove away without rushing, like he had all the time in the world. Sarah stood there shaking, watching, until his taillights disappeared. Then she went inside and found Dylan and Emma huddled in their living space, both looking shaken. Emma ran to her, wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist. "I was scared, Mom. He looked mean." Sarah held her daughter tight, looking over her head at Dylan, who stood with his arms crossed, trying to look brave. "He was testing us, seeing if we'd scare easy, but we're not going anywhere." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay on her air mattress staring at the ceiling, thinking about Victor's threat and the upcoming court hearing and all the ways this could still fall apart. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and went to the vault. She needed to understand more about Leonard, about why he'd hidden all this about what he'd wanted. She found his personal journal in a box she hadn't fully examined before. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and inside Leonard's handwriting covered page after page. Most of it was financial notes and observations about markets and investments. But scattered throughout were personal reflections that painted a picture of a complicated, lonely man. One entry from 2007 caught her attention. "The system is diseased, built on greed and lies. They've created a bubble that will destroy millions when it bursts. I see it coming. Everyone sees it coming. But no one will act because there's too much money to be made in pretending everything is fine. I will not be one of the victims. I will profit from their fall, and then I will do what they won't. I will help those they destroy." Another entry, this one from 2010. "I gave her up when she was 3 days old. My daughter. I was 25 and stupid and thought I couldn't be a father. I've spent 45 years looking for her, trying to find where she ended up, whether she had a good life. Every trail goes cold. Every lead nowhere. I think of her every day. Wonder if she's happy, if she has children of her own, if she ever thinks about the father who abandoned her." Sarah's breath caught. She flipped through more pages, finding scattered references to the daughter Leonard had given up for adoption in 1965. How he tried to find her through private investigators and adoption agencies. How the sealed records and closed adoptions of that era had made it impossible. How the guilt ate at him for decades. The last entry in the journal was dated a week before Leonard's death. "If someone finds this, know that I'm not sorry for surviving when others didn't. I'm sorry I couldn't save more of them. The money will go to Sarah Chen. She has honest eyes. I saw it when she was 7 years old, the same honesty I hope my daughter had. Maybe Sarah will do what I couldn't. Maybe she'll use this the right way." Sarah closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Leonard hadn't chosen her randomly. He'd seen something in her, recognized something during that brief meeting decades ago, and he'd trusted her with his life's work, his accumulated wealth, his chance at redemption. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The court hearing arrived on a cold morning in late November. The courtroom was packed with people Sarah didn't know, reporters in the back rows. Robert Whitmore with his expensive legal team looking confident and entitled. Victor Brennan sitting in the audience, his presence a silent threat. and Sarah wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit sitting beside Diana and feeling completely out of place. Robert's lawyer spoke first, painting Leonard as a paranoid recluse who'd cut himself off from family and rational thinking. He produced testimony from neighbors who claimed Leonard talked to himself and exhibited erratic behavior. He argued that giving a fortune to a distant relative he'd met once as a child demonstrated clear mental incompetence. Diana countered with medical records that showed no cognitive decline, no dementia, no mental illness. She called the head nurse from the assisted living facility, who testified under oath that Leonard had been sharp and engaged until his final days. She presented Leonard's journals, his detailed financial planning, his clear articulation of his wishes. Then Diana did something unexpected. She called Sarah to the stand. Sarah's legs felt weak as she walked to the witness box as the bailiff swore her in as she sat down facing the judge in the crowded courtroom. Diana's first questions were basic, establishing Sarah's identity and relationship to Leonard. Then Diana asked about the silver dollar. Sarah told the story, her voice steady despite her nerves. How Leonard had given it to her. How he'd told her to save it for something special. How she'd eventually use it to buy her mother's birthday cake when money was tight. He saw something in me that day. I was just a kid, but he looked at me like he was really seeing me. Like I mattered. I kept that silver dollar for 3 years before I spent it. And when I did spend it, it was for something that mattered. Maybe that's what he remembered. That I listened. That I cared about doing the right thing even when I was 7 years old. The courtroom was silent. Sarah glanced at Robert Whitmore and saw his confidence waver. She looked at Victor Brennan and saw him lean forward, really seeing her for the first time. Diana asked a few more questions, then let Sarah step down, but Diana wasn't finished. She produced one more piece of evidence, this one so explosive that Sarah hadn't known about it until that morning. Documents showing that Victor Brennan had tried repeatedly to buy the Riverside Inn from Leonard between 1995 and 2010. Offers increasing from $50,000 to $500,000. All refused. And correspondence between Leonard and his attorney explaining why Victor Brennan represents everything wrong with our economic system. He made millions for closing on families during the 2008 crisis, using predatory lending practices and then seizing homes when people couldn't pay. I will never let him profit from my work or my property. I would rather leave it to a stranger with honest eyes than see it go to someone like him. The courtroom erupted. Victor stood up, his face red with rage, and walked out. Robert's lawyer objected frantically, but the damage was done. The judge called for order, took a 30-minute recess, and came back with his ruling. The will is valid. Leonard Whitmore demonstrated clear mental competency in both his writings and his actions. His choice of heir, while unconventional, was legally sound and clearly reasoned. The property and associated assets go to Sarah Chen, as specified in the will. Robert slumped in his chair, defeated. His lawyer gathered papers with angry efficiency, and Sarah sat frozen, unable to process that she'd actually won. Diana's hand on her shoulder brought her back. We did it. The hard part's over. But Diana was wrong. The hard part was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Victor Brennan used every connection he had to make Sarah's life miserable. Banks that had been cooperating with Diana suddenly dragged their feet on verification processes. The county sent another inspector who found violations that required immediate expensive repairs. Local businesses that Sarah had started using, hardware stores and grocery stores, suddenly refused her service with vague excuses about policies and Mr. Brennan being a valued customer. The message was clear. Victor might have lost the legal battle, but he owned this town and he would make sure Sarah knew it. He couldn't take the property, but he could make it impossible for her to use it to profit from it, to survive long enough to see any assets transferred. He was betting she'd break, that the pressure would become too much, that she'd eventually take whatever insulting offer he made just to escape. Dylan's school called Sarah in for a meeting about his behavioral issues. When she arrived ready to defend her son, she found out he'd been assigned detention for defending himself against bullies. The principal, a man whose office featured a photo of him shaking hands with Victor Brennan, suggested that perhaps Dylan would be happier at a different school somewhere. His family's situation wouldn't cause so much disruption. Sarah left the meeting shaking with rage but powerless. She was a single mother with no connections, no reputation in this town, facing a man with money and influence who'd decided to destroy her. How was she supposed to fight that? The answer came from an unexpected source. Frank Kowalski showed up at the Riverside Inn on a Saturday afternoon, his old pickup truck loaded with tools and building materials. He climbed out slowly, one hand pressed to his chest, and Sarah rushed to help him. Frank waved her off, his voice gruff. "I'm fine. Just drove up from Detroit to see how you're managing. Your landlord, my wife, she's worried. Asked me to check on you." Sarah hadn't seen Frank since before they'd moved, and the sight of his weathered face brought tears to her eyes. "Frank, you didn't have to come all the way up here." Frank looked at the building, at the work that still needed doing, and shook his head. "Course I did. Can't have you and those kids living in a death trap. Now show me what you've got to work with, and let's make this place livable." Frank spent the next 3 days at the Riverside Inn working from dawn until dark. He taught Dylan how to identify structural problems, how to use a level and square, how to reinforce sagging joists with sisters' beams. He showed Sarah which walls were load-bearing and which could be safely modified. He brought Emma into it too, giving her small tasks like sorting hardware and holding the end of measuring tapes, making her feel part of the team rather than a burden to be protected. On the third evening, Frank sat down heavily in the one chair they'd salvaged from the lobby, his breathing labored. Sarah noticed immediately the way his hand pressed against his chest, the grayish tint to his skin. She knelt beside him, her voice tight with worry. "Frank, are you okay? Should I call someone?" Frank shook his head, but his smile was strained. "Just tired. Not as young as I used to be. Let me rest a minute." But it wasn't just tiredness. Over the next hour, Frank's condition deteriorated. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. Sarah made the call to 911, and the ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, the paramedics loading Frank onto a stretcher while he protested weakly that he was fine. Sarah followed the ambulance to Port Huron Regional Hospital, leaving Dylan in charge of Emma. In the emergency room waiting area, she called Frank's wife, Mrs. Kowalski, who started crying on the phone. Frank's brother arrived an hour later, a man in his 60s who looked like a weathered version of Frank. He introduced himself as Tom Kowalski and sat beside Sarah without speaking, both of them staring at the white walls and waiting for news. When the doctor finally emerged, her expression was serious. "Mr. Kowalski had a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. We've stabilized him, but he's in critical condition. The next 48 hours will be crucial." "Are you family?" Tom identified himself as Frank's brother. The doctor nodded and led him away for a private conversation. Sarah sat alone in the waiting room, guilt crushing her chest. Frank had come to help her, had worked himself to exhaustion for 3 days, and now he was fighting for his life because she'd been too proud or too desperate to say no. Tom came back 20 minutes later and sat beside her. His voice was rough with emotion, but not unkind. "Doctor says the heart attack was coming regardless. Frank's had 2 minor ones in the past year. Refused to slow down, refused to stop working, said sitting still made him feel like he was dying faster." Sarah's throat felt tight. "I shouldn't have let him work so hard. I should have told him to rest." Tom shook his head. "You think anyone tells Frank what to do? He chose to help you. That was his decision. And between you and me, I think helping you gave him more purpose than he'd had in months. He talked about you and your kids like you were family, like he was doing something that mattered." The words didn't make Sarah feel less guilty, but they provided a framework for understanding. Frank hadn't been working out of obligation. He'd been choosing to invest his remaining energy in something he believed was worthwhile. The question was whether Sarah was worth that investment, whether this whole endeavor would amount to anything beyond a dying man's wasted effort. She stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended, then drove back to the Riverside Inn through darkness that felt heavier than usual. Dylan and Emma were waiting up, both pale with worry. Sarah told them Frank was stable but serious, that they needed to hope and wait. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about everything that had happened in the past 3 months. The inheritance that seemed cursed, the vault full of documents that might be worthless, the legal battles and the pressure from Victor Brennan, Frank fighting for his life in a hospital bed, and through it all, her children suffering the consequences of her choices. Maybe Dylan had been right that first night. Maybe this was insane. Maybe she should have stayed in Detroit, found a cheaper apartment, figured out something else. But she'd committed to this path, and now people were paying the price. Frank, most of all. The call came at 3 in the morning, Sarah's phone vibrating on the floor beside her mattress. Tom Kowalski's voice was thick. He woke up, asked for you, can you come? Sarah was in the car 5 minutes later, still in the clothes she'd slept in. The hospital was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, only a skeleton staff moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors. Tom met her outside Frank's room and warned her before she went in. He looks rough. Don't let it scare you. Frank did look rough. Tubes and monitors connected to his body like he was a machine being kept running through artificial means. But his eyes were alert when Sarah entered, and a small smile crossed his face. There she is. How's the hotel? Sarah pulled a chair close to his bed, taking his hand carefully, afraid of dislodging something. Frank, don't worry about the hotel. Just focus on getting better. Frank's grip was weak, but insistent. I'm 70 years old, Sarah. I know how this goes. Listen to me. That building, it's solid. Better structure than I expected. Someone built it, right? Built it to last. You do the same with your life. Build something that lasts. Not just for you, for those kids. They're watching, they're learning. Show them how to stand up when people try to knock you down. Sarah felt tears on her face. I don't know if I can. Victor Brennan, he's making everything impossible. The banks won't cooperate. The town won't help. I don't know how to fight someone with that much power. Frank's eyes were fierce despite his weakness. You fight by not giving up. That's all it takes. Powerful people count on regular folks folding. When you don't fold, when you keep standing, they don't know what to do. You're stronger than you think, girl. I saw that the first day I met you in Detroit. You just need to start believing it yourself. A nurse came in to check vitals, gently suggesting that Sarah let Frank rest. Sarah squeezed his hand one more time. I'm going to finish this, Frank. I'm going to make it worth what you gave. Frank smiled. I know you will. Now get out of here and go build something beautiful. Sarah drove back to the Riverside Inn as the sun was rising. Frank's words echoing in her mind. Build something beautiful. Stand up when people try to knock you down. She thought about the vault full of documents about Leonard's fortune built on others' suffering and his attempts to atone. She thought about what Frank had said, that the building had good bones, that someone had built it to last. What if she took that literally? What if instead of just trying to survive until the assets transferred, she actually fixed the place, made it livable, made it useful, made it something that served a purpose beyond just housing her and the kids? The county violations required expensive repairs. But what if those repairs were just the beginning? What if she transformed the Riverside Inn into something that actually helped people? The idea took shape as she drove. A community center. A place where families struggling, like she'd struggled, could find resources. Job training, after-school programs for kids' support services that might prevent them from falling through the cracks the way she almost had. She could name it after Leonard and Frank, honor both men who'd given her this improbable chance. But first she needed money. The assets were still tied up in verification and probate. Diana had said months, and it had only been 3. Sarah had maybe $2,000 left from her last paychecks. The county was demanding $18,000 in repairs within 30 days. The math didn't work, unless Diana could arrange something, a loan against the pending inheritance. It was risky, potentially stupid. But what about Sarah's life lately wasn't risky and stupid? She called Diana at 8 in the morning, knowing it was too early, not caring. Diana answered on the 4th ring, her voice groggy. Sarah, what's wrong? Sarah explained her idea, words tumbling out in a rush. The community center, the repairs, the loan against future assets. Diana was silent for a long time after Sarah finished, long enough that Sarah started to think the connection had dropped. Then Diana's voice came back, more alert now. It's possible, risky but possible. If I can get a bank to agree to a bridge loan secured by verified assets, we might be able to access $50,000 to $75,000, enough for the county repairs and some additional work. But Sarah, if the assets don't come through, if there's some problem we haven't anticipated, you'll be personally liable for that debt. Sarah thought about Frank in the hospital bed, about Dylan defending her at school, about Emma's dimming optimism. She thought about what Frank had said. Build something that lasts, do it. Whatever paperwork I need to sign, get it ready. I'm done playing defense. Time to move forward. Diana's voice held a note of admiration. Okay, give me 48 hours. Those 48 hours felt like 48 days. Sarah worked her shifts at the diner and the dry cleaner, driving between Port Huron and Detroit in an exhausted haze. She visited Frank at the hospital every evening, finding him slightly stronger each day, but still frighteningly fragile. She held her kids together through sheer force of will while making meals, checking homework, pretending she had a plan, when most of the time she was making it up as she went. On the third day, Diana called with news. I found a bank, well, not a traditional bank, a credit union that specializes in small business development. They're willing to loan $70,000 against verified assets, which we now have enough of to secure. The interest rate is terrible, but the terms are manageable if the inheritance comes through in the next 6 months. Can you come to my office tomorrow to sign papers? Sarah could. Sarah would have crawled to Diana's office if necessary. The next morning, she signed documents she barely understood, initialing and dating pages until her hand cramped. When it was done, Diana transferred $70,000 into a new business account in Sarah's name. $70,000. More money than Sarah had seen in her entire life, and it was just the beginning if everything worked out. The first thing she did was pay off the county violations. $18,000 wired to Port Huron's municipal account, buying her property legitimate status for the first time since she'd inherited it. The second thing she did was hire contractors. Tom Kowalski, Frank's brother, ran a small construction company. When Sarah called him with the offer, his voice was suspicious at first, then warming when he realized she was serious and had actual funding. Tom came to the Riverside Inn the next day with two of his crew members, both men in their 40s who looked like they'd been working construction since birth. They walked through the building with Tom examining structure and systems, taking notes on clipboards. After an hour, Tom pulled Sarah aside. Frank was right. Bones are good. Foundation is solid. Most of the damage is cosmetic or systems that can be replaced. Give me $60,000 in 3 months. I can make this place safe and functional. Not pretty, but livable. Sarah hired him on the spot. The work began immediately, and the Riverside Inn transformed from a tomb into a construction site. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the settling groans. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint covered the mold. Dylan and Emma adapted to the chaos, learning to navigate around workers and equipment, fascinated by watching the building come back to life. But Victor Brennan wasn't finished. 3 weeks into the renovation, Sarah came home from her shift at the diner to find Dylan furious and one of Tom's workers packing up his tools. The worker, a young man named Miguel, explained in halting English that he'd received a call from Immigration Services. Someone had reported him as undocumented, and now he had to deal with lawyers and hearings and potential deportation. Tom was livid. Miguel's been legal for 8 years. Green card, work permit, everything proper. Someone made a false report just to harass him, and we all know who. Sarah felt cold rage settle in her chest. This was how Victor operated. He couldn't attack her directly anymore, not after the court ruling, so he attacked the people around her. Made their lives difficult, scared them away, isolated her until she had no choice but to capitulate. It was calculated cruelty, and it was working. 2 days later, Tom received notice that his business license was under review for unspecified violations. The hardware store where Sarah bought supplies suddenly claimed her credit card was declined, though her bank showed sufficient funds. Emma's teacher sent home a note suggesting Emma might benefit from counseling, given her unstable home situation. The message was clear: Victor Brennan could make everyone in Sarah's orbit suffer, and he would until she admitted defeat. She sat in the half-renovated lobby of the Riverside Inn, surrounded by construction materials and unfinished walls, and felt the weight of responsibility crushing her. Frank in the hospital, Tom's business threatened, Miguel facing deportation, her kids being harassed, all because she refused to surrender. Diana called that evening with more bad news. 3 of the banks we were working with have suddenly stopped cooperating on asset verification. They're claiming they need additional documentation, but I think someone with influence made some calls. This is going to delay everything, Sarah. We might be looking at another 6 months before we can access the major accounts. Sarah pressed her hand to her forehead, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. Can we fight it? Diana's voice was tired. We are fighting it, but bureaucracy moves slowly, and people with money can make it move even slower. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the darkness of the building that was supposed to save her family and wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Maybe she should have taken Victor's first offer. $15,000 would have been enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere he didn't own the entire town. Instead, she'd fought, and now everyone around her was paying the price. A sound from the doorway made her look up. Frank stood there leaning heavily on a walker, his brother Tom hovering protectively behind him. Sarah jumped to her feet. "Frank, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the hospital." Frank shuffled into the room, waving off her protest. "Hospital says I'm stable enough to go home. Thought I'd stop by on the way and see what you've done with the place." He looked around at the renovation in progress, at the new electrical boxes and reinforced ceiling joists at the walls that had been stripped to studs and were being rebuilt properly. A smile crossed his weathered face. "Now that's more like it. That's building something that lasts." Sarah helped him to a chair, still worried about his color, about the effort every movement seemed to cost him. Frank settled with a sen and fixed her with those keen eyes. "Tom told me about the trouble. Brennan making life difficult." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, worn and dog-eared. "I've been thinking, lying in that hospital bed with nothing to do but think. And I remembered something about Victor Brennan, something from back in the 90s when I was still working construction." He flipped through pages covered in his own handwriting notes from decades of projects and observations. "I worked on a housing development in 1997. Builder was cutting corners using substandard materials, falsifying inspection reports. Project collapsed literally. Foundation failure, structural problems. Several families had to evacuate. There was a lawsuit, but it got settled quietly. The builder's company went bankrupt, and he disappeared from the business." Frank looked up at Sarah. "That builder was Gerald Brennan, Victor's uncle, the one claiming Leonard owed him money from an old deal. And Victor was involved in that company too before the collapse. Fresh out of business school, working for his uncle, learning the family trade. When the company went under, Gerald took the fall. But Victor had already moved his money somewhere safe. Started Brennan Properties a year later, with capital that came from somewhere." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You think he defrauded investors, used the bankruptcy to hide assets?" Frank shrugged. "I think it's worth investigating. And I think a man who spent his career destroying people's homes through predatory lending and fraud shouldn't be allowed to destroy yours. Call Diana. Tell her what I told you. Let her dig." Sarah made the call immediately. Diana listened, asked Frank detailed questions, and promised to look into it. 3 days later, she called back with news. Frank's memory was good. "I found the case files from the 1997 bankruptcy. And you're right, there are irregularities. Funds transferred days before the collapse. Shell companies that vanished. If someone looked closely, really closely, there might be evidence of fraud. The kind that doesn't have a statute of limitations if it was never prosecuted." Diana's voice took on an edge Sarah hadn't heard before. "Victor Brennan has been using his reputation and influence to bully people for decades. But reputations can be fragile things. Let me make some calls. See if the Port Huron Times might be interested in a story about the town's most prominent developer and his questionable business history." The story ran 2 weeks later, front page of the Sunday edition. Local developers passed under scrutiny, questions raised about 1997 bankruptcy. The article was carefully worded, avoiding direct accusations, but it laid out the timeline of Gerald Brennan's company collapse and Victor's convenient emergence with a new business immediately after. It quoted former investors who'd lost everything when the housing development failed. It noted the similarities between the elder Brennan's predatory practices and the younger Brennan's foreclosure activities during 2008. The impact was immediate. 2 more families who'd lost homes to Brennan Properties during the financial crisis came forward with their stories. A state representative announced an inquiry into lending practices. And the bank that had been holding up Sarah's asset verification suddenly became cooperative again, as if they decided they didn't want to be seen supporting someone under investigation. Victor tried to respond with his own press release denying everything, threatening lawsuits. But the damage was done. His air of respectable authority had cracked, and people were looking at him differently now. Not as the town benefactor, but as the predator he'd always been. Frank, back home but still recovering, called Sarah with satisfaction in his voice. Powerful people count on nobody looking too close. Once people start looking, once the questions get asked, the whole thing can unravel fast. The renovation of the Riverside Inn continued, and with Victor's influence waning, the obstacles started falling away. Tom's business license review was dropped. Miguel's immigration case was resolved when someone at the agency admitted the complaint had been baseless. Local businesses stopped refusing Sarah's patronage. Emma's teacher sent a note apologizing for any misunderstanding, praising Emma's resilience and positive attitude. It wasn't forgiveness or friendship. It was just people making the calculation that Victor Brennan's protection wasn't worth the cost anymore. Sarah would take it. She'd learned that you didn't need people to like you. You just needed them to stop actively working against you. 6 months after finding the vault, Diana called with the news Sarah had been waiting for. It's done. The last major account has been verified. The IRS has reviewed the estate and determined tax liability. All the legal challenges have been resolved. Sarah, the assets are transferring. You'll see the first deposit in your account within 72 hours. Sarah sat down slowly, her legs suddenly weak. How much? Diana's voice was warm with satisfaction. After taxes, legal fees, and settling Leonard's debts, $127 million. The number still didn't feel real, even after all these months of verification and documentation. Sarah thanked Diana, hung up, and sat staring at nothing. $127 million. She thought about the $300 she'd needed for rent a year ago. She thought about the $23 in tips that had felt so desperately inadequate. When the first transfer hit her account, $5 million to provide immediate liquidity, while the larger sums were structured into trusts and investment accounts, as Sarah logged into her banking app and stared at the balance. The commas and zeros that shouldn't be there couldn't be there, but were. She paid off the bridge loan immediately, removing that weight from her shoulders. Then she started working through the list of debts she'd accumulated over years of barely surviving. Medical bills from Emma's appendectomy 3 years ago, credit card balances that had grown like tumors, a personal loan from a coworker in Detroit that she'd never been able to repay. Her car note, everything that had kept her awake at night, worrying and calculating and trying to figure out how to stretch money that was never enough. It took 3 hours to pay off everything, to watch those balances drop to zero, to feel the chains falling away one by one. When it was done, Sarah sat in her car and cried great heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Not just relief, though there was that, but grief for all the years she'd spent crushed under that weight, anger at a system that made simple survival so impossible, and gratitude fierce and overwhelming for the improbable chance that had finally freed her. She took Dylan and Emma shopping the next day. Real shopping, not the thrift store or clearance aisle, but actual stores where they could pick what they wanted without checking prices. Dylan chose new shoes that fit properly, a winter coat that wasn't 3 years old, and too small a laptop for school that didn't have a cracked screen held together with tape. He fought tears the whole time, trying to maintain his teenage composure, but Sarah saw them anyway. Emma picked out a canopy bed with matching furniture, the kind she'd been circling in catalogs since she was 6. She also chose new clothes, books, art supplies, and a stuffed rabbit to replace the one she'd been carrying since she was 3. In the parking lot afterward, Emma threw her arms around Sarah's waist. "Mom, is this real? Are we really not poor anymore?" Sarah held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. "It's real, baby. We're safe now, I promise." They moved out of the Riverside Inn into a rental house in a good neighborhood. Proper heat-working appliances, a yard where Emma could play. It was temporary, just until Sarah figured out what she wanted to do permanently. But after months of living in a construction site, it felt like a palace. Dylan got his own room for the first time in years. Emma decorated hers with all her new things, creating a space that was bright and cheerful in hers. Sarah quit both her jobs. Walking out of the diner felt surreal, giving notice to the manager who'd never appreciated her clearing out her locker for the last time. The dry cleaner was the same, that sense of closing a door on a chapter of her life she'd never wanted to write in the first place. She was 35 years old, and for the first time since she'd gotten pregnant at 22, she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over their heads. But freedom brought its own complications. Friends from her old life treated her differently now. The few people she'd stayed in touch with became distant, their conversations tinged with envy or awkwardness. Some asked for money, always framed as loans they'd definitely pay back, and Sarah had to learn to say no. It was painful every time knowing she could help, but also knowing that money changed relationships in ways that couldn't be undone. Dylan struggled at his new school. Kids who'd ignored him before suddenly wanted to be his friend, and he couldn't tell who was genuine and who just wanted proximity to wealth. He got into another fight when someone accused him of buying his grades, and the principal called Sarah in for a conference. This time, though, the principal's tone was different, deferential rather than dismissive. Money bought respect even when it shouldn't. Emma had an easier time, her natural friendliness translating well regardless of circumstances. But even she noticed changes. Birthday party invitations from kids who'd excluded her before. Teachers who suddenly found her delightful when they'd previously called her disruptive. Sarah watched her daughter navigate this new reality and worried about the lessons it taught. The Riverside Inn renovation was completed in late spring, the building transformed from ruin to something beautiful. Tom and his crew had worked miracles preserving the historic character while modernizing everything essential. The lobby gleamed with refinished wood and fresh paint. Guest rooms had been converted into program spaces. The old dining room became a community kitchen where culinary training could happen. Sarah stood in the center of the lobby, turning slowly to take it all in, and felt tears on her face again. This was what Frank had meant about building something that lasts, not just fixing a building, but creating a space where people could rebuild their lives the way she'd rebuilt hers. She named it the Leonard Whitmore and Frank Kowalski Community Center, honoring both men whose paths had intersected with hers at exactly the right moments. A plaque near the entrance explained the building's history and its new purpose, a place where second chances begin. The programming came together over the following months. After-school care for kids whose parents worked multiple jobs, giving them somewhere safe to go, instead of empty apartments or dangerous streets. Job training for adults who'd lost positions and needed new skills. Financial literacy classes teaching people how to manage money and avoid predatory lenders. Small business incubation space for entrepreneurs who had ideas but no capital. Free legal aid for families facing eviction or foreclosure. Everything Sarah wished had existed when she'd needed it. Everything that might have prevented her years of desperate struggle. She hired staff carefully looking for people who understood poverty from experience rather than theory. Rosa, the waitress from the diner, who'd warned her about Victor, became the facility manager. Tom hired graduates from the job training program for his construction company, creating a pipeline from education to employment. Frank recovered enough to move around with a cane, became a volunteer instructor in the carpentry program. He taught young people the skills he'd learned over 40 years, showing them how to build things properly, how to take pride in work done right. Dylan, now 15 and more mature than his years, volunteered in the youth programs helping younger kids with homework and showing them that someone who came from nothing could make something of themselves. Emma, at 11, organized a community garden project. She recruited volunteers, designed the layout, convinced local businesses to donate supplies. The garden produced vegetables that went to the center's food bank, feeding families who might otherwise go hungry. She'd inherited her mother's stubborn determination and was channeling it into making things grow. Sarah established the Second Chance Foundation with an initial endowment of $30 million. The foundation focused on preventing the kind of crisis that had devastated millions in 2008. Housing assistance for families facing eviction, emergency funds for medical bills or car repairs that could spiral into financial catastrophe, scholarship programs for kids whose parents couldn't afford college, legal defense against predatory lenders. She hired Diana as the foundation's legal counsel, Marcus Liu as the financial director. They built a team of people who understood that money was a tool for solving problems, not an end in itself. The foundation's annual budget was $5 million, money that could change thousands of lives if deployed carefully. National media picked up the story. From poverty to philanthropy, single mothers, 190 million transformation. Reporters called requesting interviews. Morning shows wanted her to appear and tell her story. At first, Sarah declined, uncomfortable with the attention, but Diana convinced her that publicity could amplify the foundation's impact. So Sarah did the interviews, appeared on television in borrowed professional clothes, told her story to audiences of millions. She talked about working 2 jobs and still not making rent, about sleeping in a collapsing hotel with her kids and finding a vault that changed everything, about Leonard's complicated legacy and her determination to use his money to help people hurt by the kind of crisis he'd profited from. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the foundation from people who'd survived similar struggles and wanted to help others. Other cities reached out asking about replicating the community center model. State legislators invited Sarah to testify about economic mobility and safety net programs. She became an accidental advocate, using her platform to speak for people who were still where she'd been a year ago, fighting to survive. One missed paycheck from disaster, invisible to people who'd never known that kind of fear. Victor Brennan's business empire collapsed under the weight of investigations and lawsuits. The state attorney general brought charges related to predatory lending practices. Former clients filed civil suits seeking damages. His properties went into receivership, his assets frozen. The man who tried to destroy Sarah ended up destroying himself. Sarah felt no satisfaction when she heard the news. Just sadness that it had taken this long, that he'd been allowed to hurt so many people before anyone stopped him. She thought about offering him help through the foundation, a job training program, or legal assistance, but Diana advised against it. Some bridges had been burned too thoroughly to rebuild. 2 years after inheriting the Riverside Inn, Sarah stood at Frank's bedside in the hospital again. His heart had finally given out, decades of hard work taking their final toll. He was conscious but fading. His family gathered around him, and he'd asked specifically for Sarah to come. She held his weathered hand, feeling how thin his skin had become, how fragile he was now. "Frank, I did what you said. Built something that lasts." Frank's smile was weak but genuine. "I know, girl. I've been watching. You did good. Better than good. You took that mess and made something beautiful out of it." His breathing was labored, each word an effort. "That's what life is, you know, taking the broken pieces and building something new. You learned that. You're teaching those kids. That's a legacy worth having." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without you. You saved us, Frank. You gave us time to figure it out." Frank squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "You saved yourself, Sarah. I just showed you where the tools were. Now you're showing other people. That's the whole point. We don't save people. We give them what they need to save themselves." He closed his eyes, tired from the effort of talking. Sarah stayed until his breathing evened out into sleep, then kissed his forehead and left him with his family. He died 3 hours later, peacefully surrounded by people who loved him. The funeral was large, filled with construction workers and former students and community members whose lives Frank had touched. Sarah gave a eulogy, her voice breaking, as she talked about the man who'd seen something worth saving in a desperate single mother and her crumbling hotel. She announced that the carpentry training program at the community center would be renamed the Frank Kowalski School of Building Arts, ensuring his name and his lessons lived on. The years that followed brought their own challenges and rewards. Dylan graduated high school with honors and full scholarship offers from multiple universities. He chose MIT, studying engineering with a focus on affordable housing design. His college essay, titled "Building Lives from Broken Pieces," was about his mother's transformation and what he'd learned watching her fight for a better future. Emma continued her community work, expanding the garden project into a full urban farming initiative. At 14, she was already planning a career in social work, wanting to help families before they reached the breaking point. She'd inherited Sarah's determination, but tempered it with an optimism that hadn't been crushed by poverty. Sarah herself went back to school, taking night classes in business administration and nonprofit management. She wanted to understand the systems she was trying to change, to build the foundation on solid principles rather than just good intentions. She dated occasionally cautiously, but found that most men either wanted her money or were intimidated by it. She decided she was okay being single, that she'd been taking care of herself and her kids long enough that she did not need someone else to complete her. The community center expanded, adding a second building on adjacent property Sarah purchased, then a third in a different neighborhood, then locations in 3 other Michigan cities. Each one created using the same model: practical help for people in crisis, job training, youth programs, community space. Each one named for Leonard Whitmore and Frank Kowalski, 2 men who'd given her the tools to save herself. 5 years after finding the vault, Sarah sat in the original Riverside Inn building, now the flagship location of what had become a statewide network. She was reviewing applications for the foundation's next round of housing assistance grants, each one a story of struggle and determination, when her phone rang. Diana's voice was excited. "Sarah, you need to come to my office now. I found something in Leonard's documents, something we missed before." Sarah drove to Diana's office, curiosity overriding her usual caution. Diana met her at the door and led her to the conference room where documents were spread across the table. Medical records, adoption papers, genealogy reports. Diana's hands were shaking slightly as she pointed to a birth certificate from 1965. Leonard had a daughter. We knew that from his journals. He gave her up for adoption 3 days after she was born. But what we didn't know, what even Leonard didn't know, was where she ended up. Sarah looked at the birth certificate at the mother's name she didn't recognize at the date that was before she was born. Diana flipped to another document, an adoption record that had taken months and legal wrangling to unseal. The baby was adopted by a couple in Detroit, changed her name, raised her as their own. She died of cancer in 2012. Sarah's chest tightened. She knew that date. Diana met her eyes. Sarah, your mother was adopted, and her biological father was Leonard Whitmore. The room tilted. Sarah sat down hard, staring at the documents that couldn't be real, couldn't be true. Diana continued, her voice gentle. We did a DNA comparison using samples from Leonard's medical records and your mother's hospital files. It's a match. You're not just Leonard's distant cousin by marriage. You're his biological granddaughter. Sarah couldn't breathe. All this time she'd thought Leonard had chosen her randomly, had seen something in a child he barely knew. But he'd been drawn to her because of blood, because of connection he couldn't consciously recognize, but felt anyway. The honest eyes he'd mentioned. He'd been looking at his own daughter through her, seeing the child he'd lost reflected in her granddaughter. Diana placed another document on the table. Leonard spent decades looking for his daughter, hired private investigators, searched adoption records. But the trail was too cold, the records too sealed. He never found her, never knew what happened to her, never knew about you. Sarah picked up a letter from the stack, one of Leonard's journals where he wrote about his daughter. I named her Sarah after my grandmother. I hope wherever she is, she's happy. I hope she has children. I hope they have the life I should have given her. He'd named his daughter Sarah, and his granddaughter, born years later, had been given the same name by complete coincidence. Or maybe not coincidence, maybe just the way families worked, patterns repeating across generations, names and traits and instincts passed down through blood, even when the connections were severed. Sarah thought about that family reunion when she was 7, about Leonard singling her out from all the children running around. He must have felt something, recognized something, even if he couldn't name it. That's why he'd given her the silver dollar. That's why he'd remembered her decades later when he needed to choose an heir. Not because she was a distant relative who happened to have honest eyes. Because she was family, his family, the granddaughter he'd never known he had. Diana's voice was soft. He found you without knowing he found you. Family found family. That has to mean something. Sarah sat in Diana's office for 2 hours reading through Leonard's journals and letters, seeing her mother's life reflected in his desperate searches. Leonard had tried to atone for giving up his daughter, had spent his fortune trying to help people, had left everything to the granddaughter who carried his blood and his daughter's name. It was a circle closing, a broken thing made whole, a legacy that transcended money and buildings and became about connection itself. She drove back to the Riverside Inn through streets she now knew intimately, past houses where families lived because the foundation had helped them avoid eviction, past the park, where Emma's urban farm fed hundreds of people, past Tom's construction company that employed dozens of former students from the job training program. This city that had been hostile a few years ago now felt like home, transformed by the same forces that had transformed Sarah herself. At the community center, she found Dylan and Emma working with the youth program. Dylan was teaching coding to a group of teenagers. Emma was organizing a field trip to the urban farm. Both of them looked up when Sarah entered, immediately sensing something had changed in their mother. Sarah gathered them into the small office she kept at the center, closed the door, and told them what Diana had discovered. That Leonard hadn't been a distant relative making a random choice. That he was their great-grandfather, connected to them by blood they'd never known flowed in their veins. That the silver dollar and the hotel and the fortune in the vault had all been family inheritance in the truest sense. Emma absorbed this with wide eyes. So we're actually related, like real family. Sarah nodded, still processing it herself. Real family. He just never knew it. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with that mature wisdom he had developed. Makes sense, though, why he chose you. Why this all feels like it was supposed to happen. Family finds family even when they don't know they're looking. Sarah pulled both her children close, feeling the weight of generations settling on her shoulders. Leonard's daughter given away and never found. Sarah's mother, who died never knowing her real father had been alive and searching. Sarah herself inheriting a fortune from a grandfather she'd met once without understanding the connection. And now Dylan and Emma carrying forward a legacy they'd thought was chance but was actually blood. That evening, Sarah returned to Leonard's grave for the first time since the funeral. She brought flowers and the silver dollar he'd given her as a child, the one she'd kept all these years after buying it back from the antique shop where she'd sold it decades ago. She placed both on the gravestone, tears streaming freely now. She spoke to the grandfather she'd never really known. I understand now why you gave me that coin, why you remembered me. You were looking at your daughter through me, looking at family you'd lost and trying to save what remained. I hope I made you proud. I hope Sarah, your daughter, my grandmother, would have been proud too. I'm trying to honor what you built, even if it came from pain and guilt and mistakes. I'm trying to make something beautiful out of the broken pieces. That's what Frank taught me. That's what you taught me without meaning to. We can't change where the money came from, but we can change where it goes. The sun set behind the cemetery, casting long shadows across the graves. Sarah sat there until dark, talking to ghosts and making promises. She promised to expand the foundation's reach to help more families avoid the suffering that had marked every generation of hers. She promised to teach Dylan and Emma about their great-grandfather's complicated legacy, the good and the bad, the fortune and the cost. She promised to never forget where she'd come from, even as she built something new. When she finally left, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because the burden was gone, but because she finally understood its shape. This wasn't just about money or luck or random inheritance. It was about family, about patterns that repeated across generations, about the possibility of redemption even from the grave. Leonard couldn't save his daughter, but his granddaughter could save others in her name. That had to be enough. That had to be the point. The Riverside Inn stood illuminated in the darkness, its windows glowing with life and purpose. Inside, families learned and grew and built new futures. Outside, the sign gleamed, Leonard Whitmore and Frank Kowalski, Community Center where second chances begin. Sarah looked at the building, at what had risen from ruins, and thought about everything it represented. The wealthy man who'd profited from crisis and tried to atone. The construction worker who'd spent his last energy helping a stranger. The single mother who'd refused to give up when every rational person would have quit. And the children who'd learned that wealth wasn't about having money, it was about what you built with it, who you helped with it, and whether you remembered what it felt like to have nothing when you finally had everything. The inheritance wasn't what had changed Sarah's life. Sarah had changed her own life. The inheritance had just given her the tools to do it on a scale she'd never imagined. And now those tools were available to thousands of others, each one fighting their own battles. Each one learning what she'd learned, that sometimes the most worthless-looking places hide the greatest treasures, and sometimes those treasures find their way home.